an exclusive interview with Georgia Governor Brian Kemp, plus Beto flip-flops on gun confiscation. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun. I had one friend.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of TheReload.com, where you can pick up a membership today if you want exclusive access to dozens of stories and analysis pieces that you just can't get anywhere else. On this week's episode, we have Governor Brian Kemp from Georgia, the Republican governor who's running for re-election. How are you doing, Governor?
Hey, good be on with you. Doing great. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Why don't we start off with just a little bit of background about you and your relationship with firearms. Do you own guns? If you do, what's your favorite gun? How'd you get into firearms? That sort of thing.
Man, a lot of times my favorite gun depends on what season it is, whether it's hunting or carrying or what have you. But, I've been a hunter, shooter for, a long time. My uncle kind of introduced me to that when I was a young teenager, was going deer hunting with him, and that just kind of led to my love for the outdoors and a lot of hunting, whether it was with shotguns, rifles, other things, and, developed into the older I got, obviously self-protection. And so I've got all kind of different guns from ARs to a lot of different shotguns, handguns as well. Got 3 daughters, and my wife Marty and I do. They're all shooting now, some more than others, but our oldest daughter is 21. She just got her first pistol herself and has gotten her weapons carry permit. And so we're breaking them in right to be part of this great Second Amendment culture that we have in our state and our country, or at least most places in our country. Sure.
I think everywhere, but, maybe more, it's a matter of degree, I suppose.
Yeah, it is.
Depending. But in Georgia certainly has quite a strong history of hunting and gun ownership. I think throughout the state. I've been there a number of times myself, and it's a beautiful state. So we appreciate you coming on. We obviously talk a little bit more about your campaign, some of your time in office, and some of the things that you want to do. I think we can start with the big announcement that you made going into this re-election campaign has to do with permitless carry or constitutional carry, right? Where the idea is to remove the permitting requirement for concealed carry. Can you talk a little bit about why you decided to get behind this particular policy, what it is you think is going to bring a benefit to the state of Georgia?
Yeah, well, look, I'm very excited about, constitutional carry or permitless carry, if you will, in our state. It's something that a lot of people have supported for a long time, including myself. But I think this environment now has it where we can get the votes in the General Assembly to get this passed. And as you mentioned, Georgia has been for a very long time a strong Second Amendment state. I served in the General Assembly back in the early to mid 2000s, and we certainly had a record then of supporting the Second Amendment, and it continues today, even though there's a lot of people fighting against that in our state and in our country, and we're pushing back against that. But to me, the whole constitutional carry piece this year, it's just a public safety issue. With what we've seen with civil unrest, rise in violent crime, and really a lot of our cities across the country, and certainly Atlanta's no different than that, people are just fed up. They're scared, they're fed up. There's a lot of politicians at the local level that haven't been doing anything about this rampant violent crime for a long time. We're addressing that as well with the crime suppression unit. Thankfully, the locals are starting to get in the fight with us there to send a message to these folks, but it just went on for a long time and has really frustrated a lot of people, and people are just scared. And then, during the pandemic, you had a lot of these local governments that weren't open, probate judges in Georgia that issue the carry permits weren't processing them. I talked to a guy that works on my staff the other day. It took him, over 15 months to get his weapons carry permit, which is just outrageous. Where you have other counties around the state, you can get them back in just a matter of days, or certainly no more than a few weeks. And people have just grown frustrated by that, and so we're going to push through constitutional carry right now. It's working its way through the General Assembly. There'll be a lot of people that push back on that from a national stage and people in our state, but I feel good about where we are there.
Yeah, I believe there's 31 co-sponsors in the Senate now for one of these bills. There's a couple bills going through the State House, as I understand it. Do you have one in particular that you're looking to push for?
Well, certainly, the Senate's got a bill they're working already. It's my understanding. We've been talking to the House leadership too, and some members there about them introducing a bill just where we can have two bills moving, which really is kind of good because you can have both bodies weighing in early on the policy side of it, where it doesn't get bogged down at the end of the session and, you have some sort of disagreement. So it gives us plenty of time. So we're supportive. I haven't introduced my own bill yet because we're just working with the members of the General Assembly. There's plenty of people here that want to get this done. And so we feel like we can be best effective working with all of them, let them fine tune it through the legislative process, and then we'll get a good bill done. We're also trying to get House Bill 218, which we worked hard, really, really hard last year in the governor's office to get that bill through the Senate, get it over to the House, and it just didn't quite get through. Last year was a very unusual year with the pandemic. There was a lot on our plate, and for whatever reason, it didn't get done. So we're pushing through with that too. That's more of a reciprocity bill, something that we've been working with the NRA on to make sure that, if you're licensed to carry in another state, you'll have reciprocity here. And that's certainly, what I want is a person that has a carry permit now. I like to go to other states where you can carry and not have to have some piece of paper from, another government entity to do that. We got to be careful when we pass those bills. I believe both of them will pass this year. That's what we're fighting through. We got to make sure that the language is correct, where we're not canceling something out when we pass something else, which is more of a legislative quirk. But, we've got a great group of legislators that'll, I think, help get this done this year. Appreciate anyone out there that's in Georgia that can lend us support and help lobby the General Assembly and get them to support that. But look, this is a great state besides policy for the Second Amendment and the firearms industry. We have great economics, economic development projects, manufacturers here in our state. It's a growing industry, but one that's been here for a long time. So we're continuing to promote that to provide good paying jobs and also good opportunities for a lot of great companies. Recently we announced that Remington was coming here. Obviously Remington's been broken up, but we've got the brand name coming to LaGrange, Georgia. We've got Taurus here, Glock, obviously Daniel Defense. Just really a lot of great companies. I was out at the SHOT Show recently visiting with a lot of our Georgia-based manufacturers. And I learned about other companies that we had that I didn't even know about in the state that are producing ammunition and parts and other things. So it's a growing industry here. People that, are working in these facilities in the local communities where they're going, they're really embracing that, which is great for these companies. And they're just, they're in a great state to live, work, raise their families and, exercise their Second Amendment.
Right. Yeah, certainly. We've seen a lot of exodus from sort of the northeastern states by these gun makers over the years. And some of them are landing in a number of southern states, but Georgia's been among those, as you just mentioned there with Remington. What are you doing to try and bring in more?
Well, listen, I'm kind of like every other governor in the Southeast. I'm telling them, why would you remain in a lot of the Northeast states that don't want you to be there? They continue to target you through policy, in the regulatory environment. Come south, come to Georgia, come to a place where we have a good business environment. We're strong supporters of the Second Amendment. But also we're selling them on just having a workforce that's going to want to work at a place like that can, is very familiar with their products and wants to take that pride of ownership of making those great firearms that so many Georgians and so many Americans are using every single day, whether it's for self-protection, shooting, or hunting. And that's just a culture that we've had in our state, and it's really a pretty easy sell for our state. And of course, it's an easy sell for me personally because I've been a user and a connoisseur of a lot of these products, if you will.
Certainly. So you mentioned there a bit earlier about having difficulties getting that preemption bill, or sorry, not preemption, the reciprocity bill that would increase the number of states where Georgia's concealed carry permit is recognized and vice versa. You had difficulties getting that through the legislature last year. Why are you confident that this year you'll be able to get that through in addition to constitutional carry?
Well, a couple of things. Number one, last year, it wasn't because I don't think we had the votes to do it. I think it was just, the last day of the session, they had a lot of stuff they were trying to get done. It had taken us a while to get it through the process because there was a lot of pent-up things. It was a very non-normal legislative session in the middle of COVID and what we were dealing with in Georgia at the time, and trying to keep everybody, working, get things that we had a hard time getting the year before. And it just, really ran out of time. And, that was unfortunate. I would have loved to seen it pass last year, but I feel confident we'll get it this year. And I think on constitutional carry, it's just the dynamics have changed. There's been a lot of people, including myself, like I said earlier, that have been working on this issue for years. I campaigned on this issue in 2017 and 18 when I was running for governor. But, a lot of the legislators that may have been, uneasy about this, I think with the civil unrest, violent crime, just the environment that we're seeing around the country right now. And there's also, as there's been a lot of other states that have passed this now. And it's just, to me, it's good timing for our state this year. I believe the leadership is firmly on board, which you need to have, because no matter how hard I push up here, there's always a lot of other strong leaders in the building that for whatever reasons, political or policy or otherwise, may not want to move something. But to me, I just feel like all that's lined up this year. So, I'm cautiously optimistic. We still got to get it done, but people just need to know that we're fighting in the governor's office for both of these things.
Certainly. And as far as the opposition goes, you mentioned earlier, obviously, you've seen a number of groups where these laws have passed. In other states like Texas, you had some concealed carry instructors and some police groups come out in opposition to removing the permit requirement. Do you, what do you think of those concerns? What is your response to critiques about, removing the training requirement from being able to carry a concealed firearm? What is your thought on that?
Well, there's definitely, you're going to have opposition to things like this. It's just been a policy fight in other states that we've seen around the country. I think on the law enforcement side, I had some local sheriffs that were standing with me when I announced, my support for this again this year, and kind of helping be the bully pulpit, if you will, to get this done, which sends a really strong signal to the members of the General Assembly and the leadership. And there's been others that have done that as well. There's also been some law enforcement that's uneasy about this. But, my point is, from a public safety standpoint and a personal protection, number one is a fundamental guaranteed right in the United States Constitution. But number two, the left and a lot of the folks opposing the bill here in Georgia are saying this is going to be criminal carry and all these other things. Well, look, the criminals are already carrying. They don't care what the law is. They're not going to abide by any of the stipulations that will be in this bill or the reciprocity bill or anything else. They simply do not care. What we don't want to be doing in Georgia is keeping law-abiding citizens from the ability for them to carry, and they shouldn't have a piece of paper from the government that says they're able to do that, especially in this environment when you have so many that are not processing the concealed weapons permits timely enough. And so I think that's why, to me, the opposition that's been against it, it hasn't been a lot of public opposition by a lot of the police folks, just more of concerns that they have. And, we'll certainly communicate with them, but there's plenty on the law enforcement side that see this as something that will be good.
Right. Yeah. And obviously, you often have disagreement between different groups of law enforcement officers, especially when it comes to, bigger city police chiefs versus, sheriffs. You often see disagreement on gun laws between them. Right. So that's a good point.
One of the interesting things, too, is a lot of people that are in opposition, they're the same people that are supporting some of the groups that, have protested and demonstrated and been part of the, and I wouldn't call it civil unrest because I don't think anything bad ever happened. But, yeah, a lot of people walking around with protests that were carrying long guns. And, a lot of the folks opposing constitutional carry support those groups' ability to do that. And so, my point is, let's just be consistent, for law-abiding citizens and allow them to protect themselves.
Speaking of opposition, obviously your likely Democratic opponent, if you make it to through the primary here, is going to be probably Stacey Abrams again, who you defeated last time, although I suppose she never conceded that. That's sort of something you've had to deal with quite a lot recently, people being upset about elections. But we're here to talk about guns, so I just want to focus on her quote on constitutional carry, where her critique was, it's not simply about the crimes being committed, it's about how safe we are in our own communities. She said this on a talk radio show on 95.5 WSB in Atlanta. Why would we make it easier for people who have felonies, who have mental illnesses, who have demonstrated a lack of responsibility? Why would we make it easier for them to carry weapons? Why would we make it easier for our communities to be put in harm's way? Now, my understanding is that this bill would not make it legal for somebody who has a felony or has been adjudicated mentally ill, is prohibited from owning guns, to carry guns. Is that correct? And what would your response
I think if you really translate what she's saying is, she doesn't want law-abiding people to have firearms and to be able to carry. What she's saying, obviously those individuals shouldn't be allowed to carry. The legislation would prevent that. But when you have people that break the law, they don't really care about this. This is about letting lawful people be able to carry their weapon and protect themselves. But, Stacey Abrams has been critical last year of our, you brought up elections. We passed an Elections Integrity Act. We got the strongest elections integrity law in the country now. It's easy to vote and hard to cheat here. But look, she's going to criticize everything that we do. But what's more concerning about Stacey Abrams is her words prior to what she said on WSB radio, and that she wants to confiscate your guns. I worked the whole pandemic to make sure that would never happen. With the public health state of emergency that I was given by the General Assembly, we used those powers to make sure that we protected our manufacturers so that they can continue to work the whole pandemic. They were never shut down by the government. We never prevented anyone from being able to buy or sell firearms in our state. We were the only state of any state around us that kept all of our shooting ranges, our state parks and other places open where law-abiding citizens could go there and shoot or hunt or do whatever. And because of that, we've seen this, really our whole outdoor industry, from shooting, hunting, fishing, everything has exploded. And we're just not going to allow people to confiscate guns in the state of Georgia, especially during some sort of emergency crisis that we have in our state. And to me, when you look around the country now, I think our citizens, I know here in Georgia, but I feel this way around the country too, it's now more important than ever as to who your governor is. Because you've literally seen one person in a lot of states throughout the country act more like a dictator than a governor and prohibit people from having, rights and freedoms that we're accustomed to in this country. And that's what I'm fighting for in this great state that we live in. And she would take us in the complete opposite direction. So my sights are continuing, no pun intended, to be set on her. I know that's who I'm going to be facing in the general. We feel good about having the rematch, and I'm the only candidate in the race that can beat her, and it's vital that we do that. It's vital not only for our economy and for our families in Georgia, but it's vital for our Second Amendment rights as well.
And speaking of the primary, speaking of your primary opponent, former Senator David Perdue is running against you, among several other candidates, but he's the next polls as close to you as anyone else in the race. And he also supports constitutional carry. So what do you see as the distinctions between yourself and him when it comes to gun policy?
Well, look, anybody that gets in the governor's race is now supportive of constitutional carry. I would remind you that I was for it when I campaigned back in 2017 and 18. I've got a strong Second Amendment record. My opponent was in the United States Senate. I don't know that they ever worked on doing constitutional carry at the federal level or not. He certainly had 6 years to take the opportunity to do that. So look, this is a politically correct thing that he can do now. I'm not worried about that. I'm running on my record of being a strong Second Amendment supporter, but also fulfilling the promises that I told people I would do as their governor. And, this is the fourth legislative session that I'm going into. 2 of those were in the middle of a global pandemic, and in some ways this one is as well, even though we're tailing off that now here in the state of Georgia. But despite all of that, I've passed almost every piece of legislation I promised people to do, and I look forward to fulfilling that promise this year. And I think that's what people want. They want a governor that's got a record of actually not only saying what they're going to do, but actually doing it when they're in office, which is what I've done, versus someone like my opponent who promises everything, goes and does something completely different, or is a Johnny come lately to the policy side of this.
Okay. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the NRA now. So the NRA was at your announcement where you dedicated yourself to passing constitutional carry in this legislative session here that we've talked a bit about. You've had sort of an interesting relationship with them. They endorsed your opponent in the previous campaign in the primary, but then they endorsed you once you won that campaign. And now it seems like, I don't know, they haven't endorsed you yet, but they're showing up at your announcement for constitutional carry. They were very complimentary. What's your relationship with the NRA? How are things going with them?
Yeah, it's going great. We're looking forward to having the NRA convention back in Georgia in 2025. We announced that as well when we were doing the constitutional carry rollout. The NRA has a policy not to endorse till after qualifying. So, we'll see what they do there. Obviously I'd love to have their endorsement again. But make no mistake, the last campaign, I was not the insider candidate or the establishment candidate. I was kind of the outsider that was running in that race, and the person that they endorsed had a good record with them, and so I get that. I did too. That's just politics. Same thing happened to me when I was running for the Senate against a Democrat back in the day. They actually endorsed the Democratic opponent that I ended up beating, who was an incumbent. But that's just part of what you deal with in politics, and I always tell people there's no crying in politics, but we're glad to have their support now. And I've got a strong record as an incumbent governor of standing up and fighting for the Second Amendment, fighting for, not only the NRA, but GA2A is a great group here that's, we've worked with. I'm a member of that organization as well. We had the Hunting and Fishing Federation there, Wildlife Federation. There's a lot of good groups that are supporting my campaign because they know I've been consistent over the years. And they're not just saying and doing these things because it happens to be an election year. And they know I've been here at the Capitol fighting for them, even when we couldn't get the votes in the legislature. But I think that's changed this year, and we're going to get this done.
Now, obviously, the NRA has had their own struggles internally over the last couple of years with allegations of corruption against CEO Wayne LaPierre, and now they're facing lawsuits in New York and from former contractors. They've lost a lot of revenue between 2018 and now. What do you think they're going to be able to help you in this campaign? Like, how do you view them from a practical standpoint of what the power they have in Georgia?
Well, listen, any group that's pro Second Amendment group, I'd love to have their help and support. Obviously things ebb and flow with different organizations. I mean, it's no surprise that states like New York are suing the NRA. I would beg the question of why are you in New York? Why are a lot of these gun manufacturers in the Northeast? And, a lot of this equipment that they have is very sensitive, tough to move, it's expensive to relocate. But at some point, you just have to wonder, look, is it worth it being up here fighting all these people who are so against us when you have other states like Georgia that would be a good home for you? But regardless, any group that wants to help us that's like-minded and wants to get engaged, we'd love to have their support.
Right, certainly. Now, Georgia obviously has become more of a purple state almost in the last couple of years here. Obviously, the state elected 2 Democratic senators. And, I wonder what your view on the state's trajectory is, especially when it comes to gun rights. Do you think that Democrats having those sort of statewide successes will lead to more energy for gun control proposals, or are you shifting focus? I mean, it seems like you're going with constitutional carry. That's something that a lot of gun rights activists want. Doesn't poll super well, but obviously it's a very cherished thing among a lot of gun voters. So do you see a lot of forward progress being made for the gun owning community in Georgia, or do you see a high tide coming for the gun control group movement there?
Well, look, that's a great question. I would tell people Georgia's not a purple state. The last election from a federal standpoint, it was a disaster. I was frustrated like a lot of other people with the results here, with the president, with our 2 U.S. senators. But I also think you got to realize that November 3rd, 2020, our legislators that were on the ballot at the same time these races were going on had really a great night. There was a lot of talk that the Democrats would take control of the Georgia State House. They weren't even close to doing that. They were supposed to pick up 2 or 3 seats in the Georgia State Senate. They picked up 0. We beat the minority leader, an incumbent, leader of the Democrats in the state house, and we beat an incumbent state senator. We lost a really tough race in a district that had changed, but still we knocked off one in the Senate to have a net gain. We had a Republican that won statewide on November 3rd when all that was going on. So to me, it just tells us that, I think we're a 52-48 red state. The Senate runoffs here were just a disaster just for a lot of different reasons. But I think the lesson to me is, look, we got to run. We can't just call the other side, radicals and socialists and whatever name politicians are using. We got to give Georgians a reason to vote for us. And the reason I think they're going to vote for me is because I've been delivering on the promises that I won the last election on. Focusing on education, public safety, health care, strong economy, but also standing up for our principles to continue to have Georgia the best state to live, work, and raise a family. And, to me, that was a good lesson for us. Obviously there was mechanical issues with the election that we saw, and we dealt with that a year ago to now have the strongest Elections Integrity Act in the country, like I mentioned earlier. And now we're focused this session on kitchen table issues that Georgians care about, whether it's, supporting the Second Amendment, supporting our law enforcement. We're putting more money into the Georgia Bureau of Investigation and the Attorney General's office to go after street gangs and violent crime and human trafficking. So we're standing with our law enforcement. When you have people like Stacey Abrams on the other side, they want to defund the police. So all those kind of issues I think are going to make voters look at this with a holistic view. And, when it comes to the polling on constitutional carry and Second Amendment stuff, I'll be honest with you, I'm not very trustworthy of that polling, because when you look at gun sales, I was talking to Marty Daniel at Daniel Defense about this the other day. A lot of the most first-time home buyers that we're seeing now, which is a lot of them, they're minorities and they're females. I talked to an elderly lady in the outdoor adventure store, did a little shopping after we got finished with our announcement, and she was in there buying ammunition. And I said, what are you buying ammunition for? And she told me, and she said, I bought a gun 2 years ago. And I said, well, how often you shoot? She goes, I go to the range every week. She said, I took a class. I'm a single, elderly person, so now I got a handgun for self-protection, but I took a class, got educated, and I love going to shoot. I shoot once a week, and that's why I'm here. I'm getting more ammo. So, that's a person that probably didn't really care about this issue a couple of years ago that now does.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. So with a lot of Georgia Democrats, including especially Stacey Abrams, shifting more towards gun control policies and being more favorable towards them than perhaps Democrats in the state used to be, and you see this also with Senators Warnock and Ossoff have both supported very vigorously gun control legislation and policies. Do you view that then as a mistake on the part of the Democratic Party in Georgia? Do you think it's going to come back to bite them?
Well, we'll see. I think it's going to be interesting to see how the Democrats in the legislature vote. There's a lot of them that are in really tough districts, swing districts, if you will. And that issue, especially for those that are in certain parts of the state, is going to be a very tricky issue for them. So we'll see what they end up doing. It wouldn't surprise me if they all lock down and vote against it. But look, the election will tell. We're fighting for our values here. That's what this campaign is going to be about. We got to get our base to turn out. There's a lot of people that have turned on the policies of President Biden and Senator Warnock and Senator Ossoff, whether it's the amount of spending, how ridiculous the spending's been with formulas tied to the unemployment rate that punishes states like Georgia, Florida, Texas, and other states around us like South Carolina, Tennessee that have done well, kept their economies open. We're getting penalized in the funding formula. So you see more money going to New York and California and New Jersey. I know that probably doesn't surprise any of your listeners that are out there, but like those kind of things are real issues that we'll be able to talk about in our state. And not to mention, that they want to take our guns away while they're also just letting people flood across the southern border down there in McAllen, Texas. I mean, we've got over 100 Georgia National Guard that's been down there for well over a year now trying to help the Border Patrol. It's just outmanned and doesn't have near the support that they need from this current administration in Washington. And I think people are tired of that. And they've seen real quick that what happened in 2020 has been a disaster for our country. And it's time for us to right the ships in the midterms. And quite honestly, that's going to be the playbook for how we win the presidency back in 2024. And Georgia's going to be a big part of that. And I'm looking forward to being on the team that sets the way in November of 2022.
All right. Well, Governor, we really appreciate you joining us to give an in-depth interview like this on gun policy and to take the time to do that. So we really appreciate you. Hopefully we can have you back on again, perhaps when the general election comes around.
Sounds good. Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate being with you.
Okay, it's time for our news update with contributing writer Jake Fogelman. Jake, it's nice to have you back again this week on the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, Stephen. It's great to be here.
Yeah. I think we had a good interview with Governor Kemp there. A lot of good questions. I thought he gave some fairly straightforward answers, which was always nice. It'll be interesting to see how that race plays out in the primary and then in the general election down there in Georgia. So I'm looking forward to keeping up with that one. But we have a couple more stories for you guys this week, starting off with a big settlement out of the Air Force that is related to the Texas church shooting from a couple years ago, 2017. It's a horrible massacre. Jake, can you tell us a little bit more about exactly what happened there?
Yeah, so the big news of the week is the settlement came down for the families of the victims of that shooting. The Air Force is going to be forced to pay them $230 million because it was determined in a previous court decision that they were at 60%, which in these sorts of liability cases, you adjudicate who's most at fault for the liability settlement. And they were found to be 60% at fault because they did not share his domestic violence background with the FBI, which would have prohibited him from purchasing that rifle that he used. So big settlement.
Yeah, I mean, well, he was prohibited, right? He was prohibited under federal law, but the problem was that they didn't share his records from his time when he served in the military, like you said there, right. And so he was able to go into a gun store that was a licensed dealer. He had a background check done on him, but he passed because they didn't share those records with the FBI, and so even though it was illegal for him to make the purchase, the gun dealer didn't know that because the background check system didn't work properly. And so that's what the core of this case was, right?
Correct. Yeah. So because under the Gun Control Act, he had a misdemeanor conviction of domestic violence from his time in service. He was court-martialed and was subject to a year of imprisonment, which, as we know, under federal law, prohibits you from owning, buying any kind of gun.
Yeah, he was prohibited in a couple different ways. He had a long history of criminal activity inside the military, but the military has its own criminal justice system, and so it's slightly different. Obviously, it doesn't. You're still prohibited. It's still illegal for you to own guns if you do any of the same sorts of crimes that would make you prohibited as a civilian while you're in the military. So, like, he was in the brig. He served time in military jail long enough to be prohibited, and also one of the incidents was domestic violence related, like you mentioned there, and so he was prohibited like 5 ways over, but they never shared the documents, and so he was able to buy his gun.
Yeah, and they the DoD actually launched an investigation because obviously the Air Force caught a lot of flack for this when it was uncovered that he had a record, and the DoD uncovered that there were 6 separate occasions where there was an opportunity for the Air Force to share. They're required by law to share that information with the FBI. And for whatever reason, they blamed it on training, lack of adequate training. but 6 separate occasions where they could have shared that information and they failed to do so.
Yeah, and that was an ongoing problem with the military in terms of sharing these sorts of records with the FBI for a number of different reasons. Not even just background checks, but also for, when the military is tracking down criminals, people who committed crimes in the military and then fled, or any number of different things. They often weren't sharing important documents with civilian law enforcement like the FBI, and so it was a long-running problem. They actually passed legislation to deal with this as well in the aftermath of the Sutherland Springs shooting, called Fix NICS, which just basically it added funding for increased compliance from the military branches with the statutory requirements you already outlined there. So, that was kind of the fix for this was to try and get them to comply better, because they had effectively just not done the things they were supposed to do. And eventually it led to a horrific mass shooting that took the lives of dozens of people down in Texas. This was also the incident where the bystander intervened and shot the attacker and caused him to flee. Was his name?
Stephen Williford. Yeah.
Yeah, Stephen Williford. And so, this was a horrible incident that really could have been prevented if the Air Force had actually followed through on the records keeping requirements that they were supposed to. So I guess that's the core of why they're going to now have to pay the victims' families and some of the survivors as well this large sum of money. Although, in these cases, it's always a question of like, is that going to make any difference to the Air Force going forward? It's appropriate for the families to get compensated for the failures of the Air Force, but you hope that it has some impact on the institution, but it's always kind of questionable as to whether or not it will. How much do government officials care about having to pay taxpayer dollars to a settlement like this? I don't know. So sad situation, but.
Yeah, it's difficult to say because it's not only limited to just the Air Force. We've seen this in other scenarios as well. The Dylann Roof shooting at that church in South Carolina, where it was local law enforcement that he admitted that he was a user of methamphetamine, which is also a prohibiting offense for purchasing a gun, but that was never shared with federal officials. So you sort of see this issue as a little bit endemic.
Well, I think that situation was the FBI screwed up and they asked the wrong locality for information on his pending charges that he had. There's often screw-ups like this. I think you wrote in the piece about Parkland as well. There was a settlement over a number of the screw-ups by law enforcement there too, right?
Yeah, that's right. The FBI, because it came out that the FBI was warned several times that it was a credible threat that this individual was going to attack the school, and they just failed to properly investigate. So there was a $130 million settlement last November with the families of the Parkland survivors.
Yeah. So it's not uncommon for these sorts of things to happen where these red flags are ignored or records aren't shared and they lead to horrific consequences. Obviously, it's not like every mass shooting could be prevented this way, but certainly some of the most famous ones could have been prevented through just due diligence and people following the proper record sharing procedures. So it's really quite disturbing and sad that the shooting had to happen at all, given the details here. But we also have another story this week out of Texas that has to do with Beto O'Rourke. Right, he's back in the news again. Is that right?
Yep. Beto O'Rourke was doing a campaign stop, and long story short, he was asked about his position on guns by someone in the crowd, and he totally reversed course from his infamous statement. Backed away from saying that, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, and it turns out, I guess he's not so bananas about that idea now that he's facing the electoral reality of trying to run a statewide race in Texas.
Yeah, he said specifically, and here's the quote, I'm not interested in taking anything from anyone. What I want to make sure that we do is defend the Second Amendment, which is obviously a very stark reversal from what he had said during the Democratic presidential primary back in 2019, where he said, quote, hell yes, we're going to take your AR-15, your AK-47. So the contrast between those two quotes is pretty remarkable, honestly. And I think more than anything, though, it's the timing of this reversal, because I think a lot of people would argue that he was going to have to reverse himself on this if he wanted to have a chance of winning the governorship in Texas, of all places.
Right.
But for whatever reason, that's not the strategy they went with at first. When he announced in November, and we covered this and talked about it on the podcast as well, he doubled down on confiscating AR-15s. You know, he came out and said that he stood by those comments. And then later in November, he doubled down again, saying, quote, the AR-15, or that AR-15, that AK-47 has one single solitary purpose, and that is killing people as effectively and efficiently in as great a number in as little time as possible. We saw that in Kenosha. We saw that in El Paso, Texas, where 23 people were murdered by someone with an AK-47 just in a matter of minutes. This is crazy, and we should not come to expect this as a matter of course in America. And the thing is, we don't have to. That's what he told CNN when he announced right after he announced his campaigns. It's like not only saying, yes, I stand by the idea, but doubling down on it. His argument is that there was no legitimate use for AR-15s or AK-47s, which happen to be, by the way, the most popular rifles in America. And so going from that argument that these have no legitimate purpose and should not be owned by anyone, and if you own them now, you should have to give them in or face severe consequences. He had talked about this back in 2019, that, you know, people who don't turn in the guns in this mandatory buyback that he was talking about, there would be law enforcement consequences for them. And now he's saying he doesn't want to take anything from anybody. And it's just kind of odd, you know. We did see, I guess, at one point in December, right, there was some polling on this, at least on the gun issue.
I was just going to say, I think that might just speak to a little bit of this reversal in course, because not only did he double down in November about his stance on AR-15s, but he also took shots at Greg Abbott on his what he called gun extremism right. Gun laws. But as you said, we saw in a poll among voters in Texas that 60% of people actually prefer Greg Abbott on gun policy, whereas only 33% of voters in Texas said the same for O'Rourke. So perhaps he's sort of reading the tea leaves and kind of adjusting course.
Right. Right. A 27-point gap there is pretty substantial. Right. And he's trailing significantly to Abbott overall in head-to-head polling, you know, somewhere between 10 and 15 points generally, which is not exactly a promising picture being painted of Beto's chances to win this election. But and certainly when your gun policy is that much lower, it's probably one of the driving points between why he's doing so poorly overall. But, you know, and yeah, I mean, I guess you could argue, right, that well, he doubled down and then he saw the poll numbers, but and maybe they have some internal polling as well that show this is going over poorly, in addition to what we've seen publicly. Right. But I mean, who couldn't have seen that coming though? That's my thing about it. Like,
right.
I don't, you know.
Yeah, it's almost political malpractice, you know. And what's even more noticeable, it's not even the general yet. You'd expect maybe a little bit of a pivot once the general comes, but he's still in the Democratic primary stage of this, where you typically see a little more of a stronger stance on Democratic priorities. And the fact that he's coming to the center like this before even obtaining the candidacy is pretty remarkable, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that's just such a weird strategy. I wrote about this in a members piece over at thereload.com, but it's the timing of it is so weird. If you're going to I think everyone expected he'd have to make this reversal. Yeah, like you said, maybe maybe the normal time to do it would be either before you launch the campaign or when you launch it, or when you get through the primary and make it to the general. Now, to be fair, I guess the primary is maybe not that competitive in Texas for the Democratic nomination for governor right now, but so maybe he's already got that locked up pretty well because McConaughey didn't run, so there's not a lot of other high-profile challengers at the very least. But doubling down and then a couple months later completely reversing yourself, and especially in such stark terms like that. Now he's about defending the Second Amendment instead of taking people's guns. Okay. Now, I mean, to be fair, he did this in a response to a question, so it's perhaps not a prepared line on his part that might explain some of the awkwardness of the incredible contrast there between those two statements. But the whole thing is just bizarre. I mean, Adam Serwer was on the podcast a couple months back in October, so really before Beto even launched his campaign, and we had talked about this because Adam's he writes for the Atlantic and he lives down in Texas now, and he and I predicted that he was gonna probably have to change his position on this, and then what it boils down to now is perhaps not even whether people will believe him. Right. I mean, I guess that's a question, but will anyone really buy that reversal? I don't know. But the bigger question is whether or not voters will care that much about it. Maybe they don't buy it, but they don't care because they think Beto is still going to be better than Abbott for other issues that they find more important to them. That would be the calculation here, or the way that this doesn't just completely tank his campaign. But to me, it's going to be very difficult for him to come back from. This is one of his most famous statements of all time in his whole political career. He made it it's ironic in a way because he's reversing himself now. And I think most people looking from the outside believe that that's to try and help his political chances in this Texas race. But the reason he went all in and said, hell yeah, we're going to take your AK-47s and your AR-15s, it was a political ploy. He had entered that presidential primary as with a ton of hype, and he was leading in the polls very early on in that race. And then as other candidates got in, his star faded a lot, and as he became a bottom tier candidate. And so by that September debate of 2019, where he made this declaration, he was trying to kickstart his campaign. He was trying to get attention for himself. He was trying to bring his poll numbers back up. And so that's why he did this in the first place. That's why he made this confiscation declaration, right? But it didn't work. He actually polled worse after doing that than before doing it. And at one point, he even fell all the way to 0% in a USA Today poll. And then he dropped out less than 2 months after making the declaration. So that was one of the weird things about this Texas race, is that he didn't immediately try to backtrack on this. Now he's backtracking in hopes of raising his political chances again by taking the opposite position or taking some position. To be honest with you, we don't really know what he actually thinks about the guns. Now, if you check his campaign website and you look at the gun section under issues, he's still talking about taking AR-15s and AK-47s off the streets, but he just doesn't have any sort of policy proposal connected to it. And so he's clearly going to focus more on attacking Abbott about permitless carry, like you mentioned there, because he called him an extremist, right?
Yeah, he called it gun extremism. He said it endangers public safety. It'll be interesting to see if he can form maybe a coherent gun policy now after this massive reversal. Like you said, there's no clear-cut policy.
Right. I reached out to his campaign to see if they had details on exactly why he reversed himself, in his own words, at least, and then what his new policy actually is. I imagine he still supports an assault weapons ban, but probably a more traditional
Sure.
one that bans, sales and doesn't try to confiscate ones already owned by people. That the one that has a grandfather clause, in other words, which is what everyone else is. That's what all the current laws have, more or less,
Sure.
to one degree or another. But I don't know. I guess maybe he's more in line because, it's weird to go out and try to say that Abbott's a gun extremist while you're holding the most extreme gun policy position on the left. Like, this was so extreme. You don't even see the gun control groups jumping into this. You haven't seen anything from the gun control groups saying that they agree with Beto. The major ones, Everytown, Giffords, they're not on. They don't seem to be on board with this. I think they're probably embarrassed by it to some degree because it kind of undercuts a lot of what they argue, right? Which is that nobody is coming to take your guns, that they just want these different gun safety proposals, universal background checks, bans on new sales, those sorts of things, liability for gun manufacturers. And obviously, as anyone listening to this podcast knows, there's quite a lot of debate over all of those policies and whether they're good or bad, and whether they accomplish what they set out to. But I think it's generally the case that most gun control advocates argue that they don't want to take your guns. And so you have Beto out there undermining all of that as a major national figure in the Democratic Party, saying, yes, I do want to take your guns. Perhaps now he's more in line with what the orthodoxy is on the left, on the mainstream left on guns, at least now. And he's maybe, I don't know, maybe it's more in line now to say, oh, Abbott's the actual extremist, because I don't believe in taking guns anymore. But I don't know how many people are going to buy into that who weren't already going to vote for him. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's hard to see that persuading people that aren't yet decided.
Yeah, seriously. But anyway, that's all we've got for this week. Thank you guys for tuning in again. If you like what you hear, you want to help support what we're doing over at The Reload, we can bring you more exclusive interviews like the one earlier in this podcast, or exclusive documents like the leaked NRA financials or the leaked ATF proposal on banning ghost guns and pistol braces. Well, you can head over to thereload.com and support us by buying a membership. We are a 100% reader-funded organization. We're completely independent, and we want to stay that way with your help. So check out our memberships. We have monthly memberships, yearly memberships, where you get a 2-month discount. And you also have lifetime memberships for those who want to do a little bit more to keep us going here at The Reload and help us expand and bring more gun reporting to you, more sober, serious journalism, analysis, stuff you can't get anywhere else. When you become a member, you get exclusive access to dozens of members-only posts, members-only reports, members-only analysis pieces, and you get this podcast a day early. So make sure you head over and check it out. We'll see you again next week.